The man who traded everything for nothing. Esau's story. What if I told you that one moment of hunger changed the course of two entire nations? That a single bowl of soup rewrote history itself? This isn't just another Bible story. It's the raw, unfiltered account of Esau, a man who had everything and lost it all in the span of a heartbeat. But here's what might surprise you. His story doesn't end where you think it does. Today, we're diving deep into the life of the forgotten brother, the one who history remembers as a failure. But was he really? By the end of this story, you might see Esau and yourself in a completely different light. Hit that like button if you're ready for a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about success, failure, and second chances. Picture this: a tent in ancient Canaan where Isaac, son of the great Abraham, knelt beside his wife Rebekah. For years they had waited, prayed, hoped. The promise God had given to Abraham seemed to hang in the balance. Where was their heir? Where was the next generation that would carry forward the covenant? Isaac's prayers became more desperate with each passing season. God, you promised my father descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. But Rebekah and I, we have nothing. No child, no future. Have you forgotten us? The silence stretched on. Months turned to years. But God was listening. Then it happened. Rebekah conceived. The joy should have been overwhelming, but something was wrong. Terribly wrong. This wasn't the peaceful pregnancy she had imagined. It felt like a war was raging inside her womb. Sharp kicks that took her breath away. Movements so violent and erratic that she wondered if she would survive this ordeal. Night after night, she lay awake, feeling what seemed like two separate battles happening within her. During the day, the struggle continued. She could barely walk sometimes, doubled over from the intensity of whatever was happening inside her body. "What is this?" she finally cried out to God, tears streaming down her face. The answer came not as comfort, but as prophecy, words that would echo through generations. Two nations are fighting in your womb, two peoples destined to be separated from birth. One will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. Two nations in her womb. Rebekah placed her hands on her belly, feeling the constant movement, the endless struggle. These weren't just babies she was carrying. They were the founders of entire peoples, already locked in conflict before they had even drawn their first breath. The day of birth arrived with all the drama those months of struggle had promised. Rebekah's labor was intense, almost violent. When the first child finally emerged, the midwives gasped. He was covered in thick, coarse hair from head to toe. So much that he looked like he was wearing an animal pelt. Skin had a reddish tint, like clay from the earth. Even as a newborn, he seemed strong, robust, his cries echoing through the tent like a young lion announcing his presence to the world. Esau, Isaac whispered, holding his firstborn son. "Hairy one." There was pride in his voice, wonder at this child who seemed born for the wilderness. But the birth wasn't over. Before anyone could fully absorb the miracle of Esau's arrival, another child was coming. And when he emerged, everyone in the tent fell silent. The second twin's tiny fist was wrapped around his brother's heel, his fingers locked in a grip so tight it seemed impossible for a newborn. It was as if he had been trying to pull Esau back into the womb to claim the firstborn position for himself. The determination on that baby's face was unmistakable, even at moments old. Jacob, Rebekah breathed, understanding flooding through her, the heel grabber, the one who supplants. From their very first breath, these brothers were locked in the competition that had begun in the womb. Isaac held both sons, but even then, he could feel it. The tension, the rivalry, the sense that these two would never simply be brothers. They would be something more complicated, more intense. The years that followed only confirmed what everyone had sensed in that birthing tent. As the twins grew, their differences became not just noticeable, but stark, like watching two entirely different species develop in the same household. Esau grew into everything a father of that era could want in a firstborn son. His shoulders broadened until he could carry a full-grown deer across them. His hands developed thick calluses from gripping bowstrings and wrestling with wild animals. His eyes became sharp and focused, able to spot movement in the forest that others would miss completely. When he walked into the family tent after a hunt, He brought with him the scent of pine needles, wood smoke, and wild game. He was adventure incarnate, the kind of man who could be dropped in any wilderness and not just survive, but thrive. More than that, Esau had an infectious energy about him. His laughter was loud and genuine. The stories of the hunt kept everyone riveted around the evening fire. He was spontaneous, generous with his kills, quick to share whatever he had with anyone who needed it. There was something beautifully uncomplicated about Esau. What you saw was exactly what you got. Isaac's eyes would light up whenever he heard Esau's voice calling from the distance, announcing his return from another expedition. "That's my boy," he'd whisper to himself, watching his son skin an animal with practiced precision, or describe how he had tracked a particularly clever deer for hours through difficult terrain. To Isaac, Esau represented everything a patriarch needed in an heir: strength, skill, the ability to provide for and protect the family. But as much as Isaac loved watching Esau work, there was something deeper happening. When Esau would prepare the wild game exactly the way Isaac liked it, seasoned with herbs from the hills cooked over an open fire until the meat was tender and flavorful, Isaac felt a contentment that went beyond just enjoying a good meal. It was the satisfaction of seeing his legacy carried forward, his values embodied in his firstborn son. Jacob, meanwhile, couldn't have been more different if he had been born into another family entirely. While Esau was tracking deer through thorny underbrush and sleeping under the stars, Jacob was in the cool shade of the family tent, his nimble fingers working with trade goods, his sharp mind calculating profits and losses, planning for the future in ways that went far beyond the next hunt. Jacob had an intensity about him that was quieter than his brothers, but no less powerful. He studied everything: the family stories, the promises God had made to Abraham, the customs and traditions that would be passed down through generations. Where Esau was all instinct and muscle, Jacob was strategy and intellect. Where Esau lived in the moment, Jacob was always thinking 3 steps ahead. But Jacob's intelligence came with something else, an awareness that he was second, not just second-born, but second in his father's affections. Second in line for the inheritance, second in everything that mattered in their culture. And that knowledge burned in him like a slow fire, driving him to excel in ways that might not be immediately obvious but were no less significant. Rebekah watched Jacob with a different kind of pride than Isaac felt for Esau. She saw in her younger son a depth of understanding that went beyond physical prowess. This son understood what truly mattered, not just survival, but legacy. Not just strength, but wisdom. Not just the immediate, but the eternal. And as she watched the family dynamics unfold day after day, month after month, year after year, that old prophecy kept echoing in her mind like a drumbeat. The older will serve the younger. She began to wonder not if it would happen, but how and when. The family was splitting down invisible but increasingly obvious lines. Isaac and Esau on one side, bonding over shared hunts and outdoor adventures. Rebekah and Jacob on the other, connecting over deeper conversations about faith, family, and the future. To parents, to sons, to completely different visions of what the family's destiny should be. The tension wasn't always obvious. There were plenty of peaceful family meals, shared celebrations, moments of genuine love between all 4 of them. But underneath the surface, like a river flowing beneath ice, the pressure was building. Everyone could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. Isaac would sometimes catch Rebekah looking at Jacob with a particular expression, one that suggested she knew something he didn't. Rebekah would notice how Isaac's voice changed when he talked about passing on his blessing, always assuming it would go to Esau, never even considering that there might be another plan in motion. Esau, confident in his birthright and his father's obvious favoritism, lived without much concern for the subtleties of family politics. He was secure in who he was and where he stood. Jacob, on the other hand, grew more thoughtful with each passing year, more aware of the complexities swirling around him, more conscious of opportunities that might present themselves to someone patient enough to wait for them. The storm clouds were gathering on the horizon of this family's future, and everyone could sense it. They just didn't know that the storm was about to break in the most unexpected way possible. It started with what should have been just another ordinary hunting trip. Esau had left early that morning, his bow slung across his shoulder, his quiver full of arrows. confident as always in his ability to return with fresh game. The sun was bright, the day held promise, and he had no reason to think this hunt would be any different from the hundreds that had come before. But sometimes, the most ordinary moments become the hinges on which entire destinies turn. The day that would change everything started like hundreds before it. Esau had risen before dawn, as was his custom, moving silently through the camp so as not to wake anyone. He checked his arrows, tested his bowstring, and set off into the wilderness with the easy confidence of a man who had never failed to provide for his family. But this hunt was different. The sun climbed higher and higher in the sky, and still, Esau found nothing. The usual trails were empty. The watering holes showed no fresh tracks. It was as if every animal in the region had simply vanished overnight. Hours passed, then more hours. The sun reached its peak and began its descent toward the western horizon, and still Esau's quiver remained full, his bow unused. By late afternoon, something Esau had rarely experienced began to gnaw at him: doubt. And with doubt came something even more unfamiliar: desperation. Stomach had been growling for hours, but now it was becoming painful. His water skin was nearly empty, and the heat was taking its toll on even his strong constitution. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Esau finally admitted defeat. This was the first time in years he would return home empty-handed, the first time he would disappoint his father, the first time he would have to sit at the family meal without contributing to it. The journey home felt longer than usual. Each step was heavier than the last. His legs, usually tireless, began to shake with exhaustion. His throat was parched, his stomach cramping with hunger. By the time the familiar outline of his family's encampment appeared on the horizon, Esau was stumbling more than walking. Meanwhile, back at the tents, Jacob had been having quite a different kind of day. While his brother hunted unsuccessfully in the wilderness, Jacob had been working close to home, tending to domestic affairs with his usual methodical approach. As evening approached, he had decided to prepare a meal: a thick, hearty stew made from red lentils, seasoned with herbs and cooked slowly until it reached the perfect consistency. The aroma that rose from Jacob's cooking pot was rich and inviting, the kind of smell that could make a hungry person's mouth water from a considerable distance. Jacob stirred the stew carefully, tasting it, adjusting the seasoning. He took pride in his cooking, just as Esau took pride in his hunting. Different skills, but both valuable in their own way. As the light began to fade, Jacob heard something that made him look up from his cooking.
Footsteps, slow, labored, uneven.
Nothing like the confident stride that usually announced Esau's return from a successful hunt. Jacob looked toward the sound and saw a figure approaching. But this figure was bent over, moving with obvious difficulty. It was Esau, but not the Esau that anyone in the family was used to seeing. This was a man at the end of his strength. His usual confident posture was gone, replaced by the slumped shoulders of someone who could barely keep walking. His face was flushed with heat and exhaustion, his lips cracked from thirst. Most telling of all, he carried no game. No deer slung over his shoulders, no rabbits hanging from his belt. The smell of Jacob's stew hit Esau like a physical force. His stomach clenched so violently that he nearly doubled over. The aroma was everything his starving body craved: warm, nourishing, immediately available. His eyes locked onto the pot over Jacob's fire, and for a moment, nothing else in the world existed. Brother, Esau called out, his voice hoarse and desperate. The word came out more like a croak than his usual booming tone. "Jacob, please. I need some of that stew, the red stuff. Please, I'm so hungry I think I might die." Jacob looked up from his cooking, taking in his brother's condition with those sharp, calculating eyes. Here was Esau, strong, confident, favored Esau reduced to begging. It was a sight Jacob had never seen before, and the implications weren't lost on him. Of course, brother Jacob said slowly, his voice careful and measured, "But you know, nothing in life is free. What are you willing to give me for it?" Esau stared at him, confusion mixing with desperation on his face. "What do you mean? It's just stew. We're brothers. I've shared my hunts with you countless times." "Yes, you have," Jacob agreed, stirring the pot once more. The rich aroma seemed to intensify, filling the air between them. "And this is very good stew. I've been working on it all day. Lentils are perfectly cooked. The seasoning is just right. It's probably the best batch I've ever made. Jacob paused, looking directly into his brother's eyes. Tell you what, I'll give you this entire pot of stew. All of it, enough to satisfy your hunger completely. But I want something in return. Esau was barely listening to the words. His entire focus was on the food so close he could almost taste it. Yes, whatever you want. Just give me the stew. I want your birthright. The words hung in the air between them like a thunderclap. For a moment, even Esau's hunger was forgotten as the full weight of what Jacob had just said sank in. The birthright wasn't just an inheritance, it was everything. In their culture, the firstborn received a double portion of the father's estate. But more than that, he received the responsibility of leading the family, the authority to make decisions that would affect future generations. Most importantly, the birthright carried with it the spiritual blessing. The covenant that God had made with Abraham and passed down to Isaac. The promise that, through this family line, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. You can't be serious, Esau whispered, though something in Jacob's expression told him that his brother was deadly serious indeed. I'm completely serious, Jacob replied calmly. Look at yourself, Esau. You're exhausted, starving, at the end of your strength. What good is a birthright to a dead man? But this stew can save your life right now. Esau's mind, clouded by hunger and exhaustion, struggled to process what was happening. The practical part of him knew that birthrights and blessings were important. The spiritual part of him understood that he was being asked to trade away something sacred, something that connected him to God's promises to his grandfather Abraham. But the desperate part of him, the part that was cramping with hunger and shaking with weakness, was screaming that none of that mattered if he collapsed right here and died. What's the point of having a birthright if I starve to death? Esau found himself saying, the words tumbling out before he could really think them through. What good are future blessings to me if I don't survive today? Jacob nodded as if Esau was making perfect sense. Exactly, you understand completely. The birthright is just an idea, a promise of something that might happen someday. But this stew is real. It's here. It's now. It can solve your immediate problem. Esau stammered, his eyes moving between Jacob's face and the pot of stew. The smell was driving him to distraction. His hands were shaking now, and he was unsure if it was from hunger or from the magnitude of what he was considering. Tell you what, Jacob said, moving closer to his brother. Just to make sure you're thinking clearly about this, let me ask you to swear an oath. That way we'll both know exactly where we stand. Swear to me that you're giving me your birthright in exchange for this meal. There was something almost hypnotic about Jacob's voice, something that made the trade seem not just reasonable, but inevitable. Esau found himself nodding before he fully realized what he was doing. I swear it, he said quickly, desperately. I swear I'm giving you my birthright. Now please, just give me the food. The moment the words left Esau's mouth, something shifted in the air around them. It was as if a door had closed somewhere, as if a path that had been open was now forever blocked. Jacob's expression didn't change, but there was a new satisfaction in his eyes, a sense of completion. Done, Jacob said simply, and began ladling the thick, rich stew into a bowl. Esau took the bowl with hands that shook with more than just hunger now. The stew was everything he had hoped it would be. Warm, flavorful, filling. He ate with the desperate intensity of a man who hadn't seen food in days, though it had only been since morning. He tore off pieces of bread and soaked up every drop of the broth. He drank deeply from the water Jacob provided. As his physical needs were satisfied, Esau began to feel more like himself again. His strength returned, his mind cleared, the desperate edge of hunger faded away. And as it did, a different kind of realization began to creep in. What had he just done? He looked across at Jacob, who was calmly cleaning up the cooking area, and the full weight of the transaction began to settle on him. He had traded away his birthright, his position as firstborn, his inheritance, his spiritual legacy. All of it, for a bowl of stew that was now just an empty vessel in his hands. But even as the regret began to build in his chest, another part of Esau's mind was already dismissing what had happened. It was just words, wasn't it? Just something said in a moment of desperation. Surely no one would hold him to such an agreement. Surely his father would never honor such a ridiculous trade. Esau stood up, his physical strength restored, but his world forever changed. He looked at Jacob one more time, opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. What was there to say? The deed was done, the words spoken, the oath sworn. Without another word, Esau turned and walked away from the cooking fire, away from his brother, away from the place where he had just traded his entire future for a moment's relief from hunger. Behind him, Jacob continued his careful cleanup, but there was a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The prophecy their mother had received before their birth, the older will serve the younger, had just taken its first major step toward fulfillment, but this was only the beginning. The birthright was just one part of the inheritance. There was still the matter of their father's blessing, and that would prove to be an even more dramatic confrontation. Because while Esau might dismiss what had happened today as just words spoken in desperation, Isaac had no idea that anything had changed at all. The seeds of the greatest deception in their family's history had just been planted. Years passed. Life in Isaac's household continued its familiar rhythms, but beneath the surface, everything had changed. Esau went back to his hunting, seemingly putting the birthright incident behind him. Never spoke of it, acted as if it had never happened. Perhaps he convinced himself it was just a moment of weakness, words spoken in desperation that couldn't possibly have any real meaning. Jacob, on the other hand, never forgot. He carried the knowledge of what had transpired like a secret treasure, waiting for the right moment to claim what was now legally his. He watched. He planned. Prepared. Isaac, now an old man, felt the weight of his years settling heavily upon him. His once sharp eyes had grown dim with age, leaving him nearly blind. His strong hands trembled slightly now, and his voice, while still carrying authority, had grown weaker. Most pressing of all, he felt an urgency he couldn't shake. The knowledge that his time was limited, and there were still important things left undone. The most important of these was the passing of the patriarchal blessing. This wasn't just a father's good wishes for his son. In their culture, the patriarchal blessing was a sacred act that transferred not just material inheritance, but spiritual authority. It carried with it all the promises God had made to Abraham. Promises of land, of descendants as numerous as the stars, of being a blessing to all nations. Once given, it could never be taken back. It was irrevocable, binding, eternal. On a quiet afternoon, as shadows grew long across the camp, Isaac made his decision. It was time. Esau, he called, his voice carrying the formal tone that his sons had learned to recognize as significant. My son, come here. Esau appeared quickly, still carrying the easy confidence that had always marked his relationship with his father. Yes, father. Isaac's sightless eyes turned toward the sound of his son's voice. I am old, my son. I don't know how much time I have left. The day of my death may be closer than any of us realize. Esau felt a chill run down his spine. For all their family's troubles, the thought of losing his father was almost unbearable. Before I die, Isaac continued, I want to give you my blessing. But first, I want you to do something for me. Take your weapons, your bow, and your quiver, and go out into the field. Hunt for me. Bring back fresh game, and prepare it the way I love. Seasoned, just right, cooked to perfection. When you bring it to me and I eat it, I will give you my blessing with my whole heart. Esau's chest swelled with emotion. This was it. The moment he had been preparing for his entire life. Despite everything that had happened with the birthright, his father still saw him as the rightful heir. Isaac still valued him, still chose him, still wanted to pass the family legacy to him. Of course, father, Esau said, his voice thick with feeling. I'll bring you the finest game I can find. I'll prepare it exactly as you like it. You won't be disappointed. As Esau gathered his hunting gear and headed out into the wilderness, his heart was full of purpose. This hunt would be different from that disastrous day years ago. This time, failure wasn't an option. This time he was hunting not just for food, but for his destiny. But Esau wasn't the only one who had heard Isaac's words. Rebekah had been nearby, close enough to overhear the entire conversation. As soon as Esau disappeared from sight, she felt her heart begin to race. The blessing. Isaac was about to give the blessing to Esau, the same blessing that should rightfully go to Jacob, the son who had already claimed the birthright. The son she knew was meant to carry forward God's covenant. She couldn't let this happen, not when she knew what she knew. Not when the very prophecy from God was at stake. Rebekah found Jacob quickly, her eyes bright with urgency. "Jacob, listen to me carefully. I just heard your father speaking to Esau. He's sent Esau out to hunt, and when he returns with the meat, Isaac plans to bless him before he dies." Jacob's face went pale. "The blessing, but I have the birthright." "Doesn't that mean your father doesn't know about the birthright?" Rebekah said quickly. "And even if he did, he's made his choice. It's going to bless Esau unless we do something about it. What can we do? Esau will return with the game, father will eat it, and the blessing will be given. It'll be too late." Rebekah's mind was already working, forming a plan that was as audacious as it was risky. "No, not if you get there first. Listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, and do exactly as I say." Her plan was breathtaking in its boldness. Jacob would take 2 young goats from their flock, animals that could be prepared quickly, without the time needed for hunting. Rebekah would cook them in the exact style Isaac loved, using the same seasonings and methods that had always pleased him. Jacob would then take the meal to Isaac, pretending to be Esau, and claim the blessing before his brother returned. "Mother, that's impossible," Jacob protested, though she could see his mind already working through the possibilities. Even though father can barely see, he's not completely blind. And he knows our voices. He'll know I'm not Esau the moment I speak. "We'll figure out the voice," Rebekah said dismissively. "The bigger problem is your skin. Esau's covered in hair and you're smooth. If your father touches you, he'll know immediately." But Rebekah was already moving, her plan evolving as she spoke. "The goat skins. We use the skins from the animals we slaughter. They're rough and hairy. We can tie them to your hands and neck." In the dim light of the tent, with his poor eyesight, he might not notice the difference. Jacob stared at his mother, amazed by the audacity of what she was proposing. "And if we're caught, if father realizes what we're doing?" Rebekah's expression grew fierce, determined. "Then let the curse fall on me, my son. This blessing belongs to you. God himself said so before you were born. Sometimes we have to help God's will come to pass." "But mother, the deception," Rebekah said, placing her hands on his shoulders and looking directly into his eyes. "Do you want to spend the rest of your life watching your brother receive what should be yours? Do you want to see God's promises given to someone who traded his birthright for a bowl of stew?" That argument hit home. Jacob thought about that day years ago, about Esau's careless dismissal of his spiritual heritage. If Esau could throw away his birthright so casually, did he really deserve the blessing that went with it? "All right," Jacob said finally. "Tell me what to do." What followed was a flurry of activity. Rebekah selected 2 of the best young goats from their flock and slaughtered them with practiced efficiency. While the meat cooked, she prepared the skins, cutting them into pieces that could be tied around Jacob's hands and neck. She chose Esau's best clothes from his tent garments that still carried the distinctive scent of the outdoors that Isaac associated with his older son. As the aroma of the cooking meat filled the air, Rebekah coached Jacob on how to speak, how to move, how to present himself as Esau. They practiced his responses to the questions Isaac might ask, rehearsed the entire encounter until Jacob could play his part convincingly. The hardest part was the waiting. The meat cooked to perfection. Both Rebekah and Jacob found themselves looking toward the horizon, watching for any sign of Esau's return. How long did they have? How successful would Esau's hunt be? Every minute felt like an hour. Finally, the meal was ready. Rebekah had outdone herself. The aroma was identical to what Isaac had enjoyed countless times when Esau had prepared his game. The goat meat, properly seasoned and cooked, was virtually indistinguishable from venison. "This is it," Rebekah said, helping Jacob put on Esau's clothes and tying the goat skins around his hands and neck. "Remember, keep your answers short. Don't volunteer information. And whatever happens, don't let him examine you too closely." Jacob looked down at himself, hardly believing what he was about to do. The goat skins felt strange against his smooth skin, but they did make his hands and neck feel rough and hairy. Esau's clothes hung slightly differently on him than on his broader brother. But in the dim light of Isaac's tent, perhaps the difference wouldn't be noticeable. "I can't believe we're doing this," Jacob whispered. "We're not doing this," Rebekah corrected him. "God is doing this. We're just helping it along." Taking the prepared meal, Jacob walked slowly toward his father's tent. Each step felt weighted with significance. He was walking toward either his destiny or his destruction, and he wouldn't know which until it was over. Outside Isaac's tent, Jacob paused, taking a deep breath. Once he stepped inside and spoke, there would be no turning back. This deception would either secure his future or destroy his family forever. He pushed aside the tent flap and stepped into the dim interior. "Father," he called, trying to deepen his voice to match Esau's tone. "It's me." Isaac turned his head toward the sound, his blind eyes searching. "Who is it, my son?" "I am Esau, your firstborn," Jacob lied, the words feeling strange and heavy in his mouth. "I've done as you asked. I've hunted game and prepared it for you. Please sit up and eat so that you can give me your blessing." But Isaac, despite his blindness, was not a fool. Something about this encounter felt wrong. "How did you find game so quickly, my son? It usually takes you much longer." Jacob's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. "The Lord your God gave me success," he said, and immediately regretted bringing God into his deception. Isaac frowned, still not convinced. "Come here, my son, so I can touch you and make sure you really are Esau." This was the moment of greatest danger. Jacob approached his father slowly, extending his hands. Isaac's weathered fingers explored the goatskins tied to Jacob's hands and arms, feeling the rough, hairy texture. "The voice is Jacob's," Isaac murmured, more to himself than to his son. "But the hands are Esau's." Jacob held his breath, not daring to move as his father continued his examination. For what felt like an eternity, Isaac's hands moved over the disguise, testing, questioning. "Are you really my son Esau?" Isaac asked one more time. "I am," Jacob replied, the lie coming easier now, though it still burned in his throat. Isaac seemed to accept this answer, though doubt lingered in his expression. "Bring me the food, then. Let me eat what you have hunted, so that I can bless you with my whole heart." Jacob served the meal to his father, watching anxiously as Isaac ate. Would he notice that this wasn't the wild game Esau typically brought? Would the deception be discovered at the last moment? But Rebekah's cooking was perfect. Isaac ate with obvious pleasure, savoring each bite. When he finished, he called Jacob closer. "Come here and kiss me, my son." This was the final test. Jacob leaned in and Isaac embraced him, breathing in the scent of Esau's clothes. That familiar smell of the outdoors, of wind and wild places, finally convinced Isaac completely. "Ah," Isaac said with satisfaction. "The smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed." And then Isaac began to speak the blessing, his voice taking on the formal, prophetic tone reserved for the most sacred moments. "May God give you of heaven's dew and of earth's richness, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed." Each word fell like a hammer blow, sealing Jacob's destiny and Esau's fate. The blessing that should have taken a lifetime to earn had been won through deception in a matter of minutes. Jacob trembled under the weight of what was happening, hardly able to believe that the plan had worked. When Isaac finished speaking, Jacob kissed his father once more and quietly slipped out of the tent, his heart racing with a mixture of triumph and terror. He had done it. The blessing was his. But even as Jacob was making his escape, a familiar figure appeared on the horizon. Esau was returning from his hunt, and this time he carried fresh game across his shoulders. His hunt had been successful, and he was eager to claim his blessing. The collision between expectation and reality was about to shatter this family forever. Esau approached the camp with a spring in his step that hadn't been there in years. The hunt had gone perfectly, better than perfectly. He had tracked and killed a magnificent deer, one of the finest he had ever taken. The meat would be tender and flavorful, exactly what his father loved. More importantly, this meal would earn him the blessing that would secure his future and the future of his descendants. As he worked to prepare the venison, Esau's mind wandered to what the blessing ceremony would be like. He imagined Isaac's hands on his head, the ancient words being spoken over him, the transfer of spiritual authority from father to son. Everything he had worked for, everything he was meant to be, would finally be made official. The cooking took time. Esau wanted everything to be perfect. He seasoned the meat with the exact herbs and spices he knew his father preferred. He cooked it slowly, carefully, until it reached that perfect point between tender and flavorful. The aroma that rose from his cooking fire was rich and enticing, exactly what Isaac would expect from his skilled hunter's son. Finally, the meal was ready. Esau arranged everything carefully on a tray and made his way toward Isaac's tent, his heart full of anticipation. This was his moment. This was what he had been born for. "Father," he called as he approached the tent, his voice bright with excitement. "I'm back from the hunt. I've brought you the meal you requested." From inside the tent came a sound that made Esau's blood run cold. It was a sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded almost like a sob of shock. Who is it?" Isaac's voice was trembling, confused, almost fearful. "It's me, Father. It's Esau, your firstborn son." Esau pushed aside the tent flap and stepped inside, still carrying the carefully prepared meal. "I've hunted the game as you asked. I've prepared it just the way you like it. Please sit up and eat so that you can give me your blessing." Something was terribly wrong. Isaac wasn't moving to sit up. He wasn't reaching for the food. Instead, he was staring in Esau's direction with an expression of complete shock and growing horror. "Who was it then?" Isaac whispered, his voice barely audible. "Who hunted game and brought it to me? I ate it all, just before you came, and I blessed him. And indeed he will be blessed." The words hit Esau like physical blows. The tray of food slipped from his hands and crashed to the ground, spilling the carefully prepared meal across the tent floor. For a moment he couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "What?" he finally managed to whisper. "What did you say?" "Someone else was here," Isaac said, his own voice breaking. "Someone brought me food. Someone I thought was you. And I gave him the blessing. I gave him your blessing." The full reality of what had happened began to crash over Esau like a massive wave. Someone had impersonated him. Someone had stolen his moment, his inheritance, his future. And there was only one person who would have both the motive and the opportunity to do such a thing. Jacob. Esau breathed, and in that single word was a universe of betrayal, rage, and heartbreak. When the initial shock began to wear off, it was replaced by something much more powerful, a grief so deep and raw that it tore from Esau's throat in a cry that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. It was the sound of a man who had just watched his entire world collapse. "Bless me too, my father," Esau pleaded, falling to his knees beside Isaac's bed. "Surely you have another blessing for me." Isaac's face was a mask of anguish. Old patriarch had realized that he had been deceived, manipulated, used as a tool in a deception that had torn his family apart. But the blessing, once given, could never be taken back. It was irrevocable, binding, eternal. "Your brother came deceitfully," Isaac said, each word seeming to cause him physical pain. "He took your blessing." "Jacob." Esau spat the name like a curse. "Well named indeed. It supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and now he has taken away my blessing." For the first time, Isaac learned about the birthright trade. Esau's words revealed the earlier transaction, the bowl of stew, the oath sworn in a moment of weakness. Isaac's expression grew even more stricken as he realized the full scope of what had been happening in his own household without his knowledge. But Esau wasn't finished. His grief was transforming into something else now, a desperate hope that maybe, somehow, this could still be fixed. "Haven't you reserved a blessing for me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Don't you have anything left?" Isaac's silence stretched painfully long. When he finally spoke, his words were heavy with sorrow. "I have made him lord over you," Isaac said slowly. "I have given him all his relatives as servants. I have sustained him with grain and new wine. So what can I possibly do for you, my son? You have only one blessing, my father?" Esau's voice rose to almost a shout. "Bless me too, my father." And then the sound that would haunt everyone who heard it for the rest of their lives. Esau wept aloud. This wasn't the quiet tears of disappointment. This was the raw, uncontrolled sobbing of a man whose heart had been completely shattered. The sound filled the tent, spilled out into the camp, reached the ears of everyone in the household. Rebecca, listening from outside, felt the sound cut through her like a knife. She had expected Jacob to receive the blessing, but she hadn't prepared for the devastating cost of that victory. Jacob, still nearby, heard his brother's anguish and felt something twist in his stomach. He had won, but the price was higher than he had anticipated. Isaac, moved by his son's grief, finally found words for a blessing. But it was a blessing that sounded more like a curse. Your dwelling will be away from the earth's richness, away from the dew of heaven above. You will live by the sword, and you will serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you will throw his yoke from off your neck." Even this painful blessing acknowledged that Esau would eventually break free from Jacob's dominance, but it also confirmed his secondary status. It was better than nothing, but it was a pale shadow of what should have been his. As the reality of his situation fully sank in, Esau's grief began to crystallize into something harder and more dangerous: hatred. "The days of mourning for my father are near," Esau said quietly, his tears still flowing, but his voice taking on a cold, determined edge. "Then I will kill my brother Jacob." It wasn't an empty threat. Esau was a skilled hunter, a man of the wilderness who knew how to track and kill. Jacob might be clever, but Esau was deadly. And now, for the first time in his life, Esau had murder in his heart. Word of Esau's threat reached Rebekah quickly. The same network of household servants who had helped her coordinate the deception now brought her news of its consequences. Her son Jacob had the blessing, but her other son was planning to kill him as soon as Isaac died. Rebekah acted with the same decisiveness that had characterized her involvement in the blessing deception. She found Jacob and delivered the news with characteristic bluntness. "Your brother Esau is planning to kill you," she said without preamble. "You need to leave now. Tonight." Jacob's face went pale. He had known there would be consequences, but he hadn't expected immediate threats to his life. "Where can I go?" he asked. "To my brother Laban in Haran," Rebekah replied. "Stay with him until Esau's fury subsides, till his anger turns away and he forgets what you did to him. Then I'll send word and bring you back." It was supposed to be a temporary exile, a brief cooling-off period until family tensions eased. But as Rebekah spoke these words, neither she nor Jacob realized that this brief separation would stretch into decades. That Jacob would spend the next 20 years in exile, building his own family, his own wealth, his own life far from the land of his birth. That very night, Jacob gathered what few possessions he could carry and slipped away from the camp like a fugitive. The man who had won everything was now losing everything: his home, his family, his security. He was trading a stolen blessing for a life of uncertainty and exile. Behind him, he left a father struggling with the knowledge of how completely he had been deceived, a mother who had achieved her goal but destroyed her family in the process, and a brother whose heart had been replaced by a burning desire for revenge. The family that had once gathered around evening fires to share meals and stories was now scattered and broken, perhaps permanently. The blessing had been won, but the cost was beginning to look like it might be more than anyone could bear. As Jacob disappeared into the darkness, heading toward an uncertain future in a foreign land, Esau stood outside his father's tent, staring into the night. The tears had stopped, but the pain remained, a deep, aching wound that would take years to heal, if it ever healed at all. Everything had changed. The brother who had once competed with him in the womb, who had grasped his heel at birth, who had quietly maneuvered for advantage throughout their lives, had finally succeeded completely. Jacob had the birthright, the blessing, and the future. But Esau still had his strength, his skills, and now his rage. The question was, what would he do with them? The years that followed Jacob's exile were transformative for Esau in ways no one could have predicted. With his brother gone and the immediate crisis past, Esau found himself facing a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could remain consumed by bitterness and rage, or he could forge a new path entirely. At first, the rage dominated everything. Esau threw himself into hunting with a ferocity that bordered on violence. He would disappear into the wilderness for days at a time, returning with kills so abundant that the family couldn't possibly consume them all. It was as if he was trying to hunt away his pain, to exhaust his anger through sheer physical exertion. But gradually, something unexpected began to happen. As the months passed and his initial fury cooled, Esau began to see possibilities he had never considered before. He was free now, free from the constant competition with Jacob, free from the expectations that came with being the heir apparent, free from the suffocating dynamics of a household where every interaction was colored by favoritism and rivalry. For the first time in his life, Esau could simply be himself. He began to expand his horizons beyond the immediate vicinity of Isaac's tents. His hunting expeditions took him farther and farther from home, into regions where he met other peoples other cultures, other ways of living. What he discovered surprised him. He was good with people. His straightforward nature, his lack of pretension, his obvious strength and competence. These qualities that had sometimes seemed crude compared to Jacob's sophistication were actually assets in the wider world. Esau began to form alliances, partnerships, friendships. He married, not just once, but multiple times, building connections with different peoples and expanding his influence across the region. His first marriage's two Hittite women had disappointed his parents, but now, with the family hierarchy shattered anyway, Esau felt free to make choices based on strategy and genuine affection rather than parental approval. When he later married Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael and granddaughter of Abraham, it wasn't just another marriage, it was a statement. Esau was claiming his place in the broader family of Abraham, asserting that he too was part of God's plan, even if that plan looked different than what everyone had expected. As the years passed, something remarkable happened. Esau began to prosper, not just survive but truly thrive. His natural leadership abilities, freed from the shadow of succession politics, flourished. People gravitated toward him, drawn by his honesty, his strength, his ability to make decisions quickly and stick by them. He established his own household, separate from Isaac's, and it grew rapidly. Sons and daughters were born to him, and he raised them with a different philosophy than the one he had grown up with. Where Isaac's household had been marked by favoritism and competition, Esau's was characterized by straightforwardness and mutual support. It began to spread throughout the region about this son of Isaac, who had carved out his own territory, who commanded respect from diverse peoples, who had built something impressive and lasting. Esau was becoming not just a local leader, but a regional power. Meanwhile, reports about Jacob trickled back from Haran. He too was prospering in his exile, working for his uncle Laban, acquiring wives and children and wealth. The brothers who had torn their family apart were both succeeding, but in completely different ways, in completely different places. Isaac, now truly aged and knowing his time was short, watched these developments with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Both his sons had exceeded his expectations, but the family unity he had hoped to pass down was gone forever. Or so it seemed. Then, after 20 long years, word came that would change everything. Jacob was coming home. The messenger who brought this news was dusty from hard travel, his expression grave with the weight of what he had been asked to communicate. He found Esau at his own camp, now a substantial settlement in the hill country southeast of his father's territory. "Your brother Jacob sends word," the messenger said carefully, studying Esau's face for any sign of the murderous rage that had once been common knowledge. "He is returning from Haran with his wives, his children, and his flocks, wishes to find favor in your eyes." The words hung in the air like a challenge. 20 years ago, Esau had sworn to kill Jacob as soon as their father died. Now Jacob was returning, apparently prosperous, apparently ready to reclaim his place in the family hierarchy. What would Esau do? For a long moment, Esau said nothing. The messenger waited nervously, perhaps expecting an explosion of anger, threats of violence, demands for revenge. Instead, something unexpected happened. Esau began to smile. It wasn't a cruel smile or a threatening one. It was the smile of a man who had just realized something important about himself. 20 years had changed him more than he had realized. The burning need for revenge that had once consumed him was simply gone. It's not forgotten, but transformed into something else entirely. "Tell my brother," Esau said slowly, "that I will meet him." What the messenger couldn't have known was how much those simple words represented. Esau wasn't just agreeing to see Jacob. He was choosing forgiveness over revenge, relationship over rivalry, the future over the past. But Esau being Esau, he wasn't going to make this reunion a simple affair. "And tell him," Esau added, his smile growing wider, "that I'll be bringing 400 men with me." The messenger's face went pale. 400 men. That was an army? Was Esau planning war after all? But Esau's intentions were more complex than simple revenge. Yes, he wanted Jacob to understand that he was no longer the weak, dispossessed brother who had been cheated out of his inheritance. The 400 men were a demonstration of power, a statement that Esau had built something significant during Jacob's absence. But they were also, in Esau's mind, an honor guard. If his brother was returning as a wealthy man with large flocks and a big family, then Esau would meet him as an equal, as someone who commanded respect and loyalty from hundreds of followers. When Jacob received word that Esau was coming to meet him with 400 men, his reaction was immediate and intense. Terror. In his mind, this could only mean one thing. Esau was finally coming to collect on his 20-year-old threat of murder. Jacob's response was characteristically complex and strategic. He divided his people and possessions into two groups, reasoning that if Esau attacked one group, the other might escape. He sent elaborate gifts ahead, hundreds of goats, sheep, camels, cattle, and donkeys, hoping to appease his brother's anger with generous presents. Most importantly, Jacob prayed. For the first time in the biblical narrative, we see Jacob truly wrestling with God, acknowledging his own failings, and desperately seeking divine protection. The night before the meeting, Jacob wrestled with a mysterious figure until dawn, an encounter that left him permanently changed, walking with a limp and bearing a new name, Israel. But while Jacob spent the night wrestling with God and his own conscience, Esau was making his own preparations. His 400 men weren't armed for war. They were dressed for ceremony. Esau had decided that this reunion would be a celebration, not a battle. The morning of their meeting dawned clear and bright. Jacob, still limping from his nighttime wrestling match, ranged his family carefully behind him and approached the place where his brother waited. When Esau saw Jacob in the distance, something happened that no one, least of all Jacob, had expected. Esau ran, not toward battle, not with weapon raised, but with arms open wide. He ran like a man rushing toward something precious that had been lost for too long. When he reached Jacob, he threw his powerful arms around his brother and embraced him with such force that it lifted Jacob off his feet. And then Esau wept. These weren't tears of rage or bitterness. They were tears of joy, of relief, of a love that had survived 20 years of separation and betrayal. As the two brothers held each other, both crying now, 20 years of pain and anger seemed to dissolve in an instant. "My brother," Esau said, his voice thick with emotion. "My brother, you're home." Jacob, overwhelmed by this reception he had never dared hope for, could barely speak. "Esau, I thought I was afraid." "Afraid?" Esau stepped back, holding Jacob at arm's length to look at him. "Of me, Jacob. Look around you." He gestured to his 400 men who were watching this reunion with broad smiles. These aren't soldiers come for war, they're witnesses to a celebration. But Jacob's guilt ran too deep for him to accept forgiveness so easily. He insisted on presenting his elaborate gifts, explaining them as a way to find favor in Esau's eyes. The irony wasn't lost on either brother. Jacob, who had once taken everything from Esau, was now trying to give it back. "Take your gifts, brother," Esau said with genuine warmth. "I have plenty. God has been good to me. Please," Jacob insisted. "See your face is like seeing the face of God since you have received me so favorably. Please accept these gifts, because God has been gracious to me, and I have everything I need." The conversation revealed how both brothers had changed. Jacob, humbled by years of struggle and his encounter with God, was no longer the scheming supplanter, but a man genuinely seeking reconciliation. Esau, matured by years of independence and success, was no longer the impulsive youth who had traded away his birthright, but a leader secure enough in his own achievements to offer forgiveness. Esau's final gesture was perhaps the most telling of all. He invited Jacob to return with him to his territory, to live as neighbors and rebuild their relationship properly. When Jacob politely declined, citing the needs of his young children and flocks, Esau didn't insist. He simply accepted Jacob's decision with grace. "Then let me leave some of my men with you," Esau offered, "to help with your journey." "There's no need," Jacob replied. "You've already shown me such kindness." And so the brothers parted, peacefully, lovingly, with mutual respect. Esau returned to his territory in the southeast, and Jacob continued toward his father's household. They had met as potential enemies and parted as genuine brothers. The reconciliation was complete, but it came with an understanding that their paths would remain separate. Esau had built his life and his people in one direction, Jacob in another. They could love each other without living together, respect each other without competing for the same space. In the years that followed, both brothers would continue to prosper in their separate spheres. Esau's descendants would become the nation of Edom, strong and prosperous in their mountainous territory. Jacob's descendants would become the nation of Israel, inheriting the specific promises God had made to Abraham. But the story that had begun with competition in the womb had ended with something beautiful. Two brothers who had learned that success didn't require the other as failure, that love was stronger than rivalry, and that forgiveness could transform even the deepest wounds into sources of strength. When we look back at Esau's life from this vantage point, we see something that challenges everything we thought we knew about success, failure, and what it means to live a meaningful life. Esau is often remembered as the man who sold his birthright for a bowl of stew, a cautionary tale about short-sighted thinking and misplaced priorities. And yes, that moment of weakness had profound consequences. But that single decision, devastating as it was, didn't define the entirety of who Esau became.
What if we've been looking at the story all wrong?
What if Esau's greatest strength wasn't his skill with a bow or his prowess in the wilderness, but his capacity to reinvent himself when everything fell apart? What if his true legacy isn't found in what he lost, but in what he built after losing it? Think about it. Esau had every reason to become bitter, to spend his life consumed by resentment and revenge. He had been cheated twice. His brother had manipulated his moment of weakness and then staged an elaborate deception to steal what should have been his. His mother had orchestrated the betrayal. His father had been used as an unwitting tool in the scheme. Anyone would understand if Esau had spent the rest of his life as a victim, nursing his grievances, plotting revenge, demanding that the world acknowledge how unfairly he had been treated. Instead, Esau chose something much harder. He chose to move forward. He took the pieces of his shattered expectations and built something entirely new. He discovered that he didn't need his father's blessing to command respect. He didn't need the birthright to become a leader. He didn't need Jacob's approval to create a meaningful legacy. What Esau discovered, and what his story teaches us, is that sometimes losing what we think we want most opens the door to something we never knew we needed. If Esau had received the blessing as expected, he might have spent his life living up to other people's expectations, confined by the traditional role of a patriarch's heir. Instead, freed from those constraints, he was able to discover who he really was when stripped of titles and expectations. And who was he? A natural leader who could unite diverse peoples. A man whose straightforward honesty attracted followers, someone who could build alliances across cultural boundaries. A person whose strength wasn't diminished by gentleness, whose power wasn't threatened by forgiveness. The nation that grew from Esau's lineage, Edom, became prosperous and influential in its own right. They controlled important trade routes, accumulated wealth, and played a significant role in the politics of the ancient Middle East. Esau's descendants didn't live in Jacob's shadow. They created their own sphere of influence and success. But perhaps Esau's greatest achievement wasn't political or economic. It was personal. Remember that moment when he saw Jacob approaching after 20 years of separation? Esau had 400 men at his command. He had the power to exact revenge, to balance the scales, to make Jacob pay for what he had done. Instead, he chose to run toward his brother with open arms. That wasn't weakness, it was strength of the highest order. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, requires tremendous power. It means choosing to absorb the cost of someone else's wrongdoing rather than passing it back to them. It means valuing relationship over retribution, future over past, love over justice. Esau's embrace of Jacob that day was on just a personal reconciliation. It was a masterclass in how to break cycles of revenge and bitterness that can poison families and communities for generations. But there's something else in Esau's story that speaks to us today, in our world of constant comparison and competition. Esau and Jacob's rivalry began in the womb and continued through their early years, because everyone around them insisted on ranking them, comparing them, choosing sides. Isaac preferred Esau, Rebekah preferred Jacob. Instead of celebrating what made each son unique, family created a zero-sum environment where one brother's success seemed to require the other's failure. How many families, how many workplaces, how many communities create these same dynamics? How often do we get trapped in competitions that aren't necessary, rivalries that diminish everyone involved? Esau's story suggests a different way. When he finally broke free from the need to compete with Jacob, both brothers flourished. When they stopped seeing each other as obstacles to their own success, they could finally appreciate what each had accomplished. The reconciliation scene between Esau and Jacob isn't just touching, it's revolutionary. It shows us that we can love people without living identical lives, that we can celebrate each other's success without abandoning our own paths, that different doesn't have to mean enemies. And what about those moments when we face our own bowl of stew decisions? Times when immediate pressures tempt us to trade away things of lasting value for temporary relief. Esau's story doesn't minimize the significance of such choices. The consequences were real and lasting. But it also shows us that even our worst decisions don't have to define our entire lives. Even when we fail catastrophically, we can still choose how to respond to that failure. We can choose bitterness or growth, revenge or reconciliation, victimhood or agency. Esau chose growth, reconciliation, and agency. And in doing so, he transformed a story that should have been a tragedy into something triumphant. There is one more aspect of Esau's story that deserves our attention: the role of divine sovereignty in human affairs. The prophecy given to Rebekah before the twins were born, "Older will serve the younger," seemed to stack the deck against Esau from the beginning. But when we see how both brothers' lives unfolded, we might wonder whether God's plan was more expansive than anyone realized at the time. Yes, Jacob became the heir to the covenant promises, but Esau became something significant too: the father of a nation, a leader in his own right, a man whose descendants would play important roles in the larger story of the region. What if the prophecy wasn't about one brother winning and the other losing? What if it was about two different but equally important destinies? What if God's plan was big enough to include both brothers, even when their family's limited imagination could only see room for one heir? This perspective doesn't diminish the pain of Esau's losses or excuse the deceptions that caused them. But it does suggest that even in our most painful experiences, even in our greatest failures, there might be purposes and possibilities we can't yet see. Esau's story reminds us that our lives are not determined solely by what happens to us, but by how we choose to respond to what happens to us. It shows us that forgiveness is not weakness, but strength, that different paths can lead to different kinds of success, and that sometimes losing what we think we want most opens our eyes to what we actually need. Most importantly, it challenges us to examine our own lives. Are we trapped in competitions that do unserve anyone? Are we holding on to resentments that are poisoning our own futures? Are we so focused on traditional definitions of success that we risk missing opportunities to build something meaningful in our own unique way? Esau started life as the heir apparent and ended up as something better. A man who had discovered who he really was, built something genuinely his own, and learned to love without condition. That transformation didn't happen despite his losses. It happened because of how he chose to respond to them. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful lesson his story has to offer us: that redemption is always possible, that our worst moments don't have to be our defining moments, and that sometimes the greatest victories come disguised as devastating defeats. The man who traded his birthright for a bowl of stew became the man who chose forgiveness over revenge, relationship over rivalry, and love over justice. And in making those choices, Esau discovered something more valuable than any inheritance. He discovered who he was meant to be all along. If that's not a story worth remembering, worth learning from, worth celebrating, then what is? The next time you face a setback, a betrayal, a moment when everything you thought you deserved slips through your fingers, remember Esau. Remember that your story doesn't end with your failures. Remember that you get to choose what comes next. And remember that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is run toward the people who have hurt you with your arms open wide, ready to embrace a future that's bigger than your past. Hit that like button if Esau's story has challenged how you think about success, failure, and forgiveness. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their greatest chapters might still be ahead of them. And subscribe for more stories that remind us that the human heart is capable of transformation, redemption, and love beyond anything we can imagine. Because in the end, that's what Esau's story is really about: the incredible capacity of the human spirit to choose love over hate, hope over despair, and forgiveness over revenge. And that's a message our world desperately needs to hear.